The morning in the Harborside neighborhood was damp with mist, the street-side shops just beginning to open their doors to early customers. In the light breeze carrying a faint scent of sea salt, Lucas Grant, a 45-year-old man with an unassuming appearance, wearing a faded button-down shirt and frayed hem jeans, walked across the cobblestone street toward an old wooden sign that read Harborview Diner Branch Number 7. No one inside the diner knew he was the founder of the now famous restaurant chain more than 2 decades ago. To them, he was just another unfamiliar face, perhaps a seasonal worker looking for an extra shift to make ends meet. Inside, the morning sunlight streamed through the large front windows, spilling across the worn wooden tables and the leather-upholstered booths with creases worn into the corners. The place carried the cozy air of a family diner, but if one looked closely, there was something out of tune between the soft light and the rhythm of work here. Margaret Hill, 58, her silver hair threaded with the last strands of brown, skillfully placed a hot cup of coffee in front of Lucas. Her voice was low and even, as if accustomed to speaking just loud enough to be heard. "I worked 9 hours yesterday and made exactly $1 in tips, but I'm used to it." There was no complaint, no bitterness, but something in her gaze made Lucas pause. He watched her walk away, her steps slow yet steady, and noticed in the corner of her eyes something heavier than mere fatigue. Soft notes of classic jazz drifted from the record player, mingling with the clink of spoons against cups. A few elderly couples sipped their tea leisurely, while behind the service counter, everything moved at a very different pace, quick, curt, and devoid of genuine smiles. Margaret wiped the same spot on the counter for a second time, as though the repetitive motion filled an empty space in her mind. Near the register, Dylan Ross, a tall, 28-year-old man in a crisp white shirt, stood straight as if untouchable. Every time a customer paid by card, the tips were entered through him. Lucas noticed something telling. Not a single older employee touched the POS terminal. Whenever Margaret received a bill showing a customer's tip, instead of processing it herself, she quietly set it on the counter. Dylan would come over, silently take the slip, tap a few buttons, and place it in the drawer without a word exchanged. The scene repeated over and over, too neat to be a coincidence. Lucas sat in the corner, hidden in the shadow cast by the window frame, watching Margaret closely. She remembered each customer's name, asked one about their aching hip, added a slice of lemon to another's water before they even asked. Every gesture was precise and thoughtful, as if she had worked here her whole life. Yet when customers left, she would simply smile, thank them, clear the tableware, fold the napkins, and continue on, never once touching the tips. The irregularity began to connect into a chain in Lucas's mind. As the diner started to thin out, he remained seated, watching Margaret pull from her apron a worn leather notebook. On the cover, faded but still visible, were the embossed letters M.H. 1965. She opened it, quickly jotted something down, then tucked it away carefully, as if it contained something more valuable than money. That moment told Lucas this was about more than just a few numbers. It was about quiet accumulation over time, about faith in fairness being drained away bit by bit, and perhaps about memories of the days when a tip was shared equally without the need for a machine. He leaned back in his chair, took a sip of coffee gone cold, and knew he had just stepped into a journey he could not turn away from. The afternoon passed with its familiar rhythms, but to Lucas, every moment held crucial pieces of a larger puzzle. He maintained the role of a quiet new hire, blending into the work as if he were simply learning how to carry trays or wipe tables, but in truth, he was observing. Dylan almost never left the register. Even when the diner was busy, he remained composed, occasionally adjusting his shirt cuffs, his eyes fixed solely on the POS screen and the transactions flowing through it. He carried no trays, poured no water. His entire contribution existed in the tapping of keys. Lucas noticed something. When a tip was added via credit card, there was never any action to relay that information to the server who had earned it. The number appeared on the screen, then disappeared, going directly to some destination Lucas had yet to confirm. Out on the dining floor, Margaret and Linda worked at an entirely different pace. They engaged warmly with guests, missing no small detail. Linda, with her silver hair and slightly slow gait, remembered exactly that the guest at table 6 liked their apple pie without cinnamon, while Margaret thoughtfully set extra napkins for the young mother holding her child. These gestures were not listed in any job description, yet they were what gave the diner its soul. And yet, at the point of payment, it was as if all of that came to an abrupt halt. None of them touched the register, all placing their receipts in the designated corner of the counter, the territory of Dylan. The moment that solidified Lucas's suspicions came at the very end of the lunch rush. A tall, slender regular in a beige wool coat left a $5 tip on the bill and offered Margaret a clear word of thanks. She smiled, gave a small nod, and placed the paper in its usual spot. Dylan stepped over, fingers gliding quickly across the screen, and the bill vanished into the drawer without explanation or exchanged glance. From his seat in the far corner, Lucas leaned just enough to see the POS screen flicker before returning to its home display. The tip entry had vanished without a trace. He knew that relying solely on memory or testimony would make it too easy for the matter to be dismissed. Lucas had been through dozens of audits and understood that evidence had to be sharp and indisputable. Later that afternoon, with the crowd thinned, he stepped behind the counter under the pretense of looking for more napkins, bending down to check the cabinet beneath the POS. In one practiced motion, he attached a small device that looked no different from an ordinary USB stick. It would record every action logins, permission changes, and the final destination of each tip dollar. When the device emitted a soft click and settled beneath the wood panel, Lucas knew the real game had just begun. As he straightened up, he saw Margaret rinsing out a large water jug. She didn't ask why he was there, merely gave a faint smile before returning to wipe down a table. That calm was not apathy, but the habit of someone long accustomed to staying silent about things she couldn't change. But Lucas was different. He wasn't built to stand by while a system hollowed out its most dedicated people. And in that moment, with the scent of fresh baked pastries in the air and the faint clink of cutlery in the background, he made a quiet promise to himself. No one in this diner would have to endure in silence ever again. The next morning, a thin layer of gray clouds hung over the harbor, the pale light filtering through the windows making the inside of Harborview Diner feel even quieter. Lucas arrived earlier than usual, carrying a cardboard box labeled paper supplies to avoid drawing attention. No one paid him any mind. Everyone was busy getting ready for opening. He took advantage of a few minutes to check the device he had installed the day before, his eyes catching the tiny green light blinking steadily. It had begun recording data. A sense of certainty spread through him. The questions he had would soon have clear answers. As customers began to arrive, Lucas chose to busy himself wiping tables and refilling sugar jars, keeping himself in a spot where he could watch the register. Dylan appeared about 15 minutes later, shirt still perfectly pressed, hair slicked back, wearing the expression of someone who believed he controlled the entire rhythm of the diner. Every time the POS terminal gave a soft beep, Lucas glanced just long enough to register what was happening. A table served by Linda added a tip via card, but on the screen, the recipient's name still read D. Ross. The motion was so fast that without deliberately watching, no one would notice. Mid-shift, Lucas found an excuse to step into the glass washing station where Linda was working. He asked casually, "Have you noticed folks touching the register less lately?" Linda froze for a brief second, her hand still turning a glass under the water. "Of course I've noticed," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But noticing and speaking up are two different things." After a short pause, she continued, eyes fixed on the sink. "I'm 70 years old, raising my granddaughter after work. Medicine costs more than my paycheck now. If I speak up, they'll replace me instantly. Younger people come in faster and cheaper. Someone like me doesn't get a second chance." Lucas didn't respond, only gave a small nod, though a heavy weight settled in his chest. He had seen many forms of silence, apathy, fear, even resignation, but this was the kind born from self-preservation, from someone who had endured too much to believe resistance was worth the risk. That afternoon, he noticed a new paper posted on the break room wall, right above the microwave. In bold print, it read, "Servers are not permitted to operate the POS terminal." Beneath it was the slanted signature of Sophie Kane. Directly below, another sheet read, "All electronic tip transactions must be processed by the shift manager." No signature. But the meaning was obvious. The paper was still crisp and unstained by coffee or grease, which meant the rule had been introduced recently. Lucas stepped back, his expression unchanged, but in his mind another piece had locked into place. The system wasn't broken, it was built this way. And those notices weren't meant to protect employees, but to cut them off from benefits that were rightfully theirs. At the end of the shift, while Margaret was refilling the sugar jar, she spoke quietly as if making small talk. "I'm not looking to get rich from this job. I just want to see my name on the tip share list, that's all." She didn't look at Lucas, just kept arranging each packet neatly. Then, as if to close the conversation, she walked away, her back straight, apron crisply folded. Lucas stood still, the cloth still in his hand, knowing he couldn't let those words disappear into the air one more time. Afternoons at Harborview Diner usually moved at a slower pace than the mornings, but for Lucas, every moment was another clue worth noting. As the crowd thinned, he sat at a table near the window, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him, though he barely touched it. On his phone, a private data dashboard was open, a report only someone at the founder's level could access. Branch 7's revenue was steady, even ranking among the top performers in the chain. Customer satisfaction scores were high, feedback was positive, and the average ticket value was rising. But there was one column he couldn't ignore: staff turnover. The number was unusually high, and when he compared it to past records, he saw that the names disappearing the fastest were mostly employees over the age of 50. Scrolling through previous years' rosters, Lucas recognized many faces from archived security footage, people who had once appeared in the Harborview family promotional videos, now gone. They had left after only weeks or months. The cold numbers didn't state the reason, but to Lucas, the answer was becoming clearer. The pressure wasn't from the workload, but from the way people were being pushed out through rules disguised as harmless policy. Lost in thought, he spotted Sophie Kane near the stockroom, clipboard in hand, tapping her pen against the edge as if counting each second. Lucas walked over, his tone light. "Busy day, huh?" Sophie offered a polite smile. "It's always like this. You get used to it." He nodded, feigning casual curiosity. "I've noticed not everyone uses the register." "Any reason for that?" Sophie let out a short, easy laugh. "Oh, it just keeps things running smoother. Older staff tend to forget the steps, hit the wrong keys, mess up the system. I've made a few adjustments to avoid mistakes." Her voice lowered as if sharing a secret. "Nothing personal, just organizing the workflow sensibly." Lucas watched her walk away, the clipboard swaying with her stride. He had heard many lies in his career, but the most dangerous were always the ones wrapped in a gentle tone and a reasonable excuse. A little later, an older gentleman in a checkered shirt laid a $20 bill and his receipt on the counter, telling Margaret, "Keep the change." She thanked him, stepped back half a pace, and as usual, Dylan stepped in immediately. "Let me take care of that," he said quickly, his fingers moving across the POS with practiced speed. From his spot at the side counter, pretending to sort cup lids, Lucas caught the screen displaying Branch Operations Fund in the tip recipient field. Dylan hit confirm without hesitation, then walked away, whistling a tune. This wasn't a slip, it was a habit, and now Lucas had a clear label for the hole the tip money was disappearing into. That evening, in a small motel room serving as his makeshift office, Lucas sat at the desk with his laptop open to the tracking device's data file. Lines of records scrolled slowly, each transaction logged in detail. Which table, who served it, who processed it, who received the tip. The results repeated over and over. Whether the server was Margaret, Linda, or anyone else, the tip recipient field always read D. Ross. This wasn't a technical glitch, this wasn't human error. It was a fixed route, a funnel leading to one single point. Leaning back in his chair, eyes tracing the dim yellow glow from the desk lamp, Lucas knew he now had everything he needed to expose the truth. On Friday morning, the diner had barely opened when the clinking of cutlery, The scrape of chairs and the aroma of fresh brewed coffee filled the air. Lucas chose a quiet corner, a spot from which he could see both the counter and the entrance. Only a few minutes later, Margaret approached, a silver tray in her arms, and set down on the table before him something familiar, the worn brown leather notebook, its corners frayed, the faintly embossed letters on the cover still visible. M.H. 1965. She didn't look directly at him, only kept her hand resting on the cover, her voice low but steady. No one listens once you're old. They smile, they nod, and then they forget. So I just stopped speaking. Lucas slowly opened the notebook. The yellowed pages were neatly ruled into columns. Date, shift, table number, tip amount reported by the customer, tip amount recorded in the system, brief notes in the margins. Many numbers were circled in red or underlined, with annotations like no match, not recorded, or processed by D. Ross. He turned each page carefully, missing nothing. This was no random collection of scraps. It was a meticulous, persistent log, a living record Margaret had been quietly keeping day after day. This isn't about revenge, she went on, her tone strangely calm. It's about memory, because they're not going to remember for us. Lucas closed the notebook with both hands, holding it to his chest like a silent promise. He gave no verbal commitment, but in his mind, the decision to act was already taking shape with absolute clarity. As the afternoon wore on and the diner emptied, Lucas sat alone at the table by the window, flipping back to the final page. The total stood out plainly. $700 March through April. Each line was a small amount gone missing, but added together it represented weeks of labor and countless nights Margaret must have weighed whether to pay the electric bill or buy groceries. In his mind's eye, an image of Margaret's memory played out. A cold hospital hallway, the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, her seated outside a patient's room, holding a medical bill so long it could not be read in one glance. In her wallet, only a few wrinkled bills tips from countless shifts, still not enough. Her husband, lying in the hospital bed, took her hand gently but firmly, telling her, "You always manage to take care of everything." She had done it all her life. Only that day, fairness had not been on her side. Near closing time, a young employee dropped a spoon in the kitchen. Margaret bent to help, moving so deftly that the glasses on her tray didn't so much as tremble. From behind the counter, Dylan said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Tips aren't a right, they're a bonus, and no one is obligated to share." A half smile crossed his face as his fingers tapped out a few more keys. Lucas heard the words from across the room, his eyes narrowing slightly. In the world of business, he had heard many justifications for wrongdoing, but rarely one so short and cold. Not because it was shouted, but because it was spoken as if it were truth. And that was exactly when he knew the time for silence was over. Saturday morning, Harborview Diner was busier than usual. Sunlight reflected off the surface of the sea and streamed in through the large glass windows, casting a warm glow over the wooden tables worn smooth by years of use. The hum of conversation mingled with the clatter of plates and cups, creating a lively yet slightly chaotic soundtrack. Lucas sat in his familiar corner, eyes tracking every movement in the diner. He wasn't looking for a dramatic moment, but waiting for the small details, the kind that would complete the bigger picture. Dylan remained at his post behind the register, his posture unchanged, one hand always close to the POS keyboard, his gaze fixed almost entirely on the screen. He smiled at customers, but never once glanced toward the floor, where Margaret, Linda, and the others moved in an easy rhythm between the tables. Sophie Kane, dressed in a navy blazer, stepped out from the back office, her smile carefully prepared as she greeted a few familiar patrons. She looked around the room but didn't once meet Margaret's eyes. Everything appeared normal, and that was precisely the danger. Injustice here was disguised neatly beneath a veneer of order and professionalism. No one would suspect a thing with just a passing glance. But then the door opened, and Lucas entered once again, this time not in an apron or faded shirt. He wore a well-tailored gray suit, polished shoes, and carried a sharp gaze that made the surrounding chatter slow. A few customers recognized him first, whispering quietly to each other. Sophie paused mid-step, her smile faltering slightly. Dylan, still at the counter, straightened up as if bracing for a surprise inspection. Margaret, pouring coffee at table 4, glanced up briefly, her eyes meeting Lucas's without a word. Lucas walked straight to the counter, placing both hands on the smooth wooden surface. His voice was low and steady. "I am Lucas Grant, founder of Harborview Diner." A few sharp intakes of breath followed. He continued without raising his tone. "Over the past week, I've been working in this branch to understand why a location with strong sales and high customer ratings also has the highest turnover rate in the entire chain." His gaze swept over each face, Sophie, Dylan, Margaret, before stopping. "What I've found is not a failure of procedure. It's a failure in how people are treated." The air seemed to grow heavier. Lucas reached into his jacket and pulled out a tablet, setting it on the counter. With a few taps, a chart appeared, showing tip transactions from the last 60 days. The columns were clear. 76% of all tips had been redirected into a fund not recognized in company policy, the Branch Operations Fund. Only 2 accounts had the authority to perform this action, S. Kane and D. Ross. A murmur rose from the customers. Sophie pressed her lips together. Dylan's hand tightened at his side. Lucas didn't stop. He switched to another screen data pulled from the tracking device hidden under the counter. Margaret Hill, 82% of all tables served this past week, and yet not a single electronic tip transaction lists her name. He paused just long enough for everyone's eyes to focus on the display, where the name D. Ross appeared again and again under the recipient column. This was no longer suspicion. Everything was now undeniable. Margaret straightened her back, her eyes still fixed on the screen, offering no explanation. She had known this truth for a long time, but now everyone else could see it too. And for Lucas, this was only the first step. The rest would leave no room for excuses. The air in the diner felt stretched tight, every sound so sharp it seemed you could hear the clock on the wall ticking forward one notch at a time. Margaret stepped out from behind the counter, her hand still carrying the faint warmth of the coffee cup she had just set down for a customer. She wasn't trembling, but her fingers curled slightly before she placed them gently on the counter. Her voice was low, not loud, but each word landed with the weight of a nail driven into the wood. "I'm not asking for compensation. I don't need the money returned. I don't even want an apology. I just want the system to see me." She paused, her eyes moving to the screen where the name D. Ross still glowed bright. "I want my name to appear not as a data entry error, not as a shadow behind someone else's work. I served those tables. I received those thank yous. I earned every single one of those tips." From the corner, Linda stepped forward. Her voice trembled slightly, but her words were clear. "I signed a piece of paper they called a confidentiality agreement. They said it was only about scheduling, but when I asked why my tips never showed up, I was told that if I kept asking, my shifts would be cut." A few murmurs rippled through the room, and then a male customer spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I always tip Margaret." The woman sitting beside him nodded firmly, arms crossed. "They deserve to be treated better than this." The voices of agreement spread through the diner, at first in whispers, then growing into a wave. No one stood to shout, but the air had changed. The silence that had once swallowed the room was now broken. Margaret tilted her head slightly toward Linda, the corner of her mouth lifting just enough to be seen. They had lived too long in a world where silence was the price of survival. Now, speaking out was the only way to keep going, and more importantly, it meant never having to speak alone again. Lucas stood still, not stepping in to interrupt the flow. He knew what was happening could not be forced. It had to rise on its own. This was the moment when real power did not lie in a tablet or a spreadsheet, but in the voices thought to have been lost. And once those voices began to speak, they would not be silenced easily. That afternoon, a brief announcement came from the back office, the dry voice of the assistant manager stating, "Sophie Kane is suspended effective immediately pending investigation." There was no explanation, no farewell. Sophie emerged, her face stripped of its usual confidence, quietly took her coat and slipped out the side door to avoid the customer's eyes. Dylan stood frozen at the counter. When Lucas approached, he didn't say a word, simply removed his employee badge, placed it on the countertop, and stepped back. An IT technician, arranged by Lucas beforehand, moved in to reclaim Dylan's POS access, plugged a device into the maintenance port, and began updating the system. Within minutes, lines of code streamed across the screen confirming the most important change. Server name equals tip recipient. No more vague clauses, no more workarounds. Margaret stood nearby, not interfering, only watching. When the update was complete, Lucas motioned for her to step over to a table that had just paid. She took the bill, smiled, thanked the customer, and entered the tip information into the machine herself. On the screen, the name Margaret Hill appeared clearly and boldly, without an asterisk or footnote. No one clapped, no one cheered, yet the change resonated louder than any formal declaration. Lucas looked at the screen, then at Margaret. He didn't speak, but his eyes conveyed the message. For the first time in many years, the system was working exactly as it should. The diner's atmosphere bustled as usual, but somewhere within it, a new kind of silence, the silence of reassurance, was beginning to spread. A week later, the morning at Harborview Diner was calmer than usual. The wind from the harbor carried the scent of salt and the steady rhythm of waves hitting the wooden pier. Lucas sat at the table by the window, the one Margaret always cleaned first each morning, with a thick folder in front of him, its cover clearly labeled Veteran Staff Honor Program. He slid it toward Margaret as she approached. "We're building a new program," Lucas said, his voice steady and warm. "Not just a certificate for the wall, but a real role, an advisory position to the HR department. Your voice will be right at the center." He paused, letting the offer settle. "I want you to help lead it." Margaret froze for a moment. She looked at the folder, then at Lucas. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, but she didn't rush to answer. Resting her hand on the cover, she gently smoothed it as if feeling every fiber of the paper. "Thank you, truly," she said slowly. Then she gave a slight shake of her head, her eyes showing neither sadness nor regret. "But I'm not ready to sit in an office. This is where I belong, among the laughter, the sound of spoons against cups, among the people whose faces I see every day." Lucas stayed silent for a moment, then nodded. He understood that for Margaret, recognition didn't have to come with a title. For her, the real joy lay in being present, being seen, and doing the work she loved in a fair environment. The position could wait, but the chance to live fully in each moment could not. On Saturday afternoon, the golden slant of sunlight streamed through the cafe's wide glass windows, pooling on the long row of tables pushed together in the corner. 8 regular customers sat gathered around a faded floral tablecloth, each with a porcelain teacup and a plate of orange sponge cake dusted with powdered sugar. Margaret no longer carried the look of a busy employee. Today she seemed more like a hostess welcoming old friends. She poured tea slowly, asking after grandchildren, the tomato harvest in their gardens, or an old song that had just played again on the record machine. Gentle laughter drifted through the corner of the diner, mingling with the soft clink of spoons against china. No one checked their watches. No sharp beep from the POS machine cut in only the steady, peaceful rhythm Margaret had once feared was gone forever. From across the room, Lucas stood with his arms folded, leaning lightly against the counter, quietly observing. He knew profit could never measure this moment, yet its value was far greater than any number on a balance sheet. Linda was there too, no longer wearing her apron, but instead a beige scarf draped around her neck. She had retired, but every Tuesday she still came by, choosing the table by the window. The week before, a white envelope had arrived in her hands. Inside was a letter from Harborview headquarters and a card confirming that the Veteran Staff Health Support Fund had been approved. Lucas's signature sat neatly at the bottom. There was no meeting, no camera flash, just a quiet acknowledgement that she deserved to live with a lighter burden. When Margaret asked about her health, Linda replied with just one word: light. It wasn't retirement, but the lifting of a weight that had pressed on her for far too long. And for Lucas, this moment was the clearest proof that fairness doesn't come only from changing rules or adjusting systems, but from giving people back their right to breathe, to live, and to exist without fear. From the perspective of someone who has witnessed hundreds of business models rise and fall, I believe the most enduring foundation of any organization does not lie in sophisticated management systems or impressive profit figures, but in how they preserve fairness and respect for every individual who stands behind the counter, carries each tray of drinks, or wipes down every table. A business can expand through processes, but only kindness can create a culture strong enough to endure through the years. The story of Margaret and Lucas is not merely about fixing a POS system, but a reminder that when a true leader chooses to look directly and take action, they do more than change a spreadsheet. They change the very rhythm of life for those who have been overlooked. And sometimes, justice does not arrive in the sound of loud applause, but quietly, when a person's name is recorded in the right place at the right time and acknowledged exactly as it should be. If you too believe that fairness is strength, leave a comment with the 3 words "to be seen" to help spread this value. Don't forget to hit like if this story resonates with you, and subscribe to continue joining us on journeys to restore justice in corners of the world that seemed long forgotten.